Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca El Paraiso Luna Geisha Innovator Protocol Processed Colombia from Wes Ngopi. And there's the bag right there. And Wes Ngopi, based out of Shah, Malaysia. And there are coffee roasts that's appeared on this channel quite a bit since we first discovered them last year. However, we did take a several-month hiatus from reviewing their coffees after they had changed roasting machines, as a lot of people found their coffees to be a bit more developed than they were before that transition. Since then, we've heard from several others, as well as Wes Ngopi themselves, that they have sorted out their profile, so it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 51. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which usually indicates a more medium grind. However, we also went a fair bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, this one was definitely closer to the experiences we had had with Wes Ngopi before they changed roasting machines, which we'd previously described as being on the more moderately light side of things, as they're significantly lighter than the only other Malaysian-based coffee roaster we've reviewed on this channel, which is of course 1/2, but in comparison to some other world-based coffee roasters out there, I can say that it is still a little bit lighter than some of the experiences we've had with some of the Nordic-based coffee roasters recently, which does include both April and Tim Wendelboe. So for that reason, we will continue to align them with being on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 26, first impression through the V60, and the very first takeaway I had from this coffee was that the aroma itself yields a super prominent grape nerds feel once the coffee is actually being brewed itself, and that did definitely translate pretty heavily into the experience itself, as it's probably the closest iteration to the original Luna Bermudas we've had from Manhattan ever, especially in the way that it did present itself in a unique blueberry sense. It did offer a very wild first impression, but that's on par with the expectations that you can have from these very processed Diego Bermudez coffees. Day 30 through the Chemex, and there's a pretty similar takeaway this time around, as it's super grape forward, reminiscent of an artificial grape, something like a grape juice, a grape Kool-Aid, or even a grape gel like feel to it. In addition to that, there's not too much outside of that very grape forward experience, as it's pretty blatant and straightforward without offering much fermentiness or booziness. So for those that have had the very unique Diego Bermudez coffees, those of course being Letty, Luna, and Salma, you can tell that they are presenting in a very different way than a lot of the more processed Colombian coffees, as they seem to be void of that specific fermentiness or booziness. They present a very defined sense, even if it does feel very artificial in a lot of ways. Day 33 through the UFO Brewer, and the coffee was actually the best it had been to this point, as it's offering a much more even sense to it, with a little bit of heaviness as well. It does have a much more direct feel to what I would describe as being that grape nerds representation of this coffee, even more so than it had up to this point, with a very intense and long-lasting feel to it. And as of this moment, this coffee has been, I want to say, mostly one note, one direction, as it's just so grape nerds forward based off the first couple of experiences we did have. And you can kind of expand upon that and describe it in other artificial sugary grape descriptors like we had mentioned before. But when it came down to it at the very end, this coffee was about as grape nerds forward as I think I could have ever experienced from any coffee. Day 36 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments. Was kind of curious to see what would happen if we push this coffee 17:1, 99 Celsius, and a more fine grind. And the coffee is surprisingly the best it had been to this point, as this one did seem to benefit from being pushed a little bit, as there's a more clear representation of that very prominent grape nerds feel. Big issue I continue to have with this coffee is that it might be a little bit too one note, as there's very little outside of that strong artificial grape feel. Day 39 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was actually the best it had been to this point, as now it's offering a little bit more depth to it. This time I can see something a bit more reminiscent of a blueberry pie or a blueberry Pop-Tart, which, if my memory serves me correct, I believe that the original Manhattan iteration of the Luna Bermudez coffee highlighted and focused on the blueberry Pop-Tart-like aspect of this coffee, as it has that very artificial grape feel to it, that very artificial blueberry feel to it, which was definitely represented on this day. In addition to that, there's a slightly tart aspect to it in terms of that grape quality, so it had a bit more of that kind of purple-blue feel, giving it just some additional depth. Day 42 through the V60 with her standard recipe, and there are mixed impressions of this coffee yet again, as going back down on the adjustments did seem to highlight and accentuate a lot of those grape qualities once again, as it became a one-note coffee in terms of that grape nerds-like sense. So had some kind of mixed impressions of it. Once again, very long-lasting and intense, but not a lot of depth this time around either. And on day 45, back through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's back to focusing on that grape nerds-like feel. So for the majority of the time when we were working with this coffee, if we kept the extraction at our standard level and we brewed it with either brew method, specifically the V60, we were getting just a very heavy grape nerds feel to it. I shouldn't use the word heavy because it wasn't heavy as in terms of the processing, but just very intense and defined in that specific sense. Day 48, back through the Chemex with the higher extraction adjustments, and it continues to feel like the very best representation of this coffee, as it gives it a multi-dimensional blue and purple feel, as opposed to what's a pretty one-note feel otherwise, as it is a bit reminiscent of what I would describe as that lavender blueberry Pop-Tart-like feel, which is the descriptor I had for the very first Luna Bermudas we'd reviewed on this channel, in a very intense and well-defined sense. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 5s. Let's go through those. And I don't think any of them will come as a surprise whatsoever. Finish level 5, sweetness level 5, and berry fruit level 5. We'll discuss all 3 of those together, largely because they all seem to collaborate with each other pretty heavily. So this one is about as blueberry, or I guess in a lot of cases, grape nerds forward as it could possibly be for any coffee. Now, I like this one when we were pushing it a lot more, and I really want to focus and highlight that day specifically because I could give or take the grape nerds feel. I am not the biggest fan of grape nerds. I think they're actually my least favorite flavor of nerds in general. So I didn't love that aspect of this coffee, and when I was able to get that much more blue depth to this one, I enjoyed it significantly more. Regardless, it's extremely sweet, and for anybody that's had any of these Diego Bermudez coffees, and again, I want to highlight and focus on these 3, Salma, Luna, and Letty, because they have a very different feel to them. They're just so artificial, sugary forward throughout the entirety of them that the sweetness is going to score minimum level 5, and if anything, you can bump it up a little higher. This coffee was hyper sweet. These coffees in general tend to be hyper sweet, and this one specifically focuses more on the berry aspects of that. Now, they do have a bunch of notes listed on here, but when it comes to Luna Bermudez, it is a mostly one-directional coffee for me, and you can kind of see that represented within this tasting wheel. And that one direction is specifically that berry fruit quality to it, as regardless of which one you want to focus on, the grape quality or the blueberry quality, it's just very intense in that level 5 sense, which is demonstrated by the sweetness and a very long-lasting finish to it as well. Let's go through the level 4, other than the cleanliness, which is the florality level 4. So I mentioned that it has that kind of lavender feel, but it also is attributed to this coffee being so purple and blue focused that it did give it that specific floral quality and depth to it. And I remember the very first time I had Luna Bermudez that it reminded me a lot of candles. And for anybody that doesn't know, my mom collects a lot of candles. And as a result, I have smelled candles very similar to the way that this coffee tastes. And I believe the first time I ever described Luna Bermudez, I said that it reminds me of some candles I've smelled from Bed Bath & Body Works before, or Bath & Body Works before. And that's where the florality comes into play with this coffee, as it definitely scores that level 4 in that sense. And then there's kind of 2 other things worth discussing outside of the cleanliness. We'll go to the acidity real quick, level 3. Not the brightest coffee, and if my memory serves me correct, I do believe that the original Luna Bermudez coffee wasn't the brightest either. I don't think that's ever the intention of these coffees. But when you think about it, it's a very heavily processed Colombian coffee, and the acidity is kept down. It's not uneven and completely destroying the structure of this coffee. That's always kind of interesting to me. Not the brightest with this one either. Body level 2. And I'll kind of spoil this. We're also reviewing the Letty Bermudez, and I think that the Letty Bermudez specifically highlighted that the body's a little higher, but for me, both of them were a little bit lighter bodied. That level 2 mark is where we opted to put both of them, but I wanted to highlight that mostly because I think that this is the one they didn't highlight, this one having a little bit more body than the Letty Bermudez, but regardless, they were pretty similar for me, both at that level 2 mark. And then the final and most important thing worth discussing easily, that is the cleanliness level 4. I have said it before with certain other coffees that were nowhere near as defined as this one is. I can't really dock points from the cleanliness of these coffees, largely because they're absent of any of these super fermenty, super funky, super boozy qualities that can be associated with really processed Colombian coffees. And you can think of the other Diego Bermudez coffees we've reviewed. The one I'm thinking of most specifically is from Jimmy Beans, where in theory, it should have something that detracts from the overall cleanliness of it, but this coffee was just so focused on those two qualities, but most specifically that grape nerds quality throughout, that there's really nothing I can take away from the overall cleanliness. If anything, it's actually on the higher side of level 4, largely because of just how well defined the experience is, even if it's super artificial feeling. So level 4 is where we opted to put that, and as a result, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I definitely do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. One thing that actually surprised me going into this review is that I've only reviewed Luna Bermudez from one other coffee roaster, which is of course the original review that we did have from Manhattan, I want to say close to 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago now. It's been a bit since that coffee. However, as I'm kind of thinking back on that, I did have a very strong preference towards Lady Bermudez when comparing them side by side, as I had kind of mixed impressions of the way that the blue qualities in that coffee were presenting themselves, and I think that that was abundant within this experience as well, as it's so unique, and the entire time I was working through this coffee, it just reminded me a fair bit of that original Luna review, but most specifically when we did adjust this coffee to get to the point where it was much more blueberry focused, it was just such a spitting image and representation of that original experience that we did have from Manhattan that it reminded me of that. And it reminded me of the fact that I enjoyed that coffee nowhere near as good as Lady Bermudez was for me that year. So it was just kind of worth highlighting that, as of course we do have the Lady Bermudez review coming up next of our Wes Ngopi review. So definitely stay tuned for that. But even then, these Diego Bermudez coffees, when they're done well, they're just very interesting. And this one was very interesting as well, even if at times it was a little bit more one note than I would prefer. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I do think that Wes Ngopi did a pretty good job with these Diego Bermudez coffees. So if you've never had one before and you specifically like those two things that I've highlighted throughout the entirety of this review, grape nerds, that blueberry Pop-Tart feel, then this one right here is going to be about as straightforward of a representation of that as you could possibly ever experience from any coffee. So I definitely suggest it for those people and people that always look for that kind of blueberry bomb with a cleaner feel to it, not offering that fermentiness, heaviness, booziness that a lot of more processed coffees can offer. This one presents all of those things in a very well-defined sense. So that's another direction I would point somebody towards on this one, but it's also the best way I think I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca El Paraiso Luna Geisha Innovative Protocol Processed Colombia from Wes Ngopi. Thank you for watching.